손절님 어서오세요. 원래 오늘 아무것도 안 할 것 같아가지고 변동성도 없고 가만히 있다가 방송도 안 하고 원래 휴방이었거든요? 근데 아까 여기서 뭔가 오를 것 같아가지고 제가 스위칭을 과감하게 하고 짧게 익절을 걸어놨는데 이게 체결이 안 됐어요. 아까 원래 여기 있던 거 제가 이렇게 내린 거거든요? 여기쯤에 있던 거? 그리고 지금 레버리지도 좀 높아가지고 좀 내려가면 청산이라 이거는 좀 보여드리고 짧게 하더라도 이거 좀 보여드리고 끝내야 될 것 같아서 지금 하필이면 정확하게 제 거 평단가에 있네요. 또 운전했네. 야. 오늘도 뭐 파월 뭐 있다면서요. 연설인가? 어제는 청문회였고 오늘이 연설인가 뭐 한다는데 그것 때문에 좀 무빙이 나온 것 같아요. 뭐 1시에 한다 그랬나? 파월 없는데? 아까 뭐 짭구 방송 보니까 오늘 연설 같은 거 한다고. 그런 거 없는데? 하는 거 맞나? 내려가잖아. 아니 이것 좀 체결시켜주고 내려가지 그랬으면 대박인데. 바로 위에 있는 거 이거를 체결 안 시켜주냐? 난 왜 맨날 이래요? 이거 어떡하지? 지금 와서 스위칭 해야 되나? 지금이라도? 네, 뭐 12시에 파월 연설 한다고 하더라고요. 저는 있는지 몰랐는데 짭구 방송 보니까 네. 나 원래 이거 익절 나가면 바로 스위칭 하려고 그랬거든요. 근데 이거 익절이 안 나갔어. 잠몽님 또 와. 이렇게 반응 있을 때는 보여드려야죠. 원래는 제가 오늘 변동성이 너무 없길래 제가 시드 많이 들어가 있지도 않고 해가지고 오늘 휴방을 해야겠다 생각하고 있다가 차트 보고 있는데 뭔가 여기서 바로 올라갈 것 같은 그런 느낌이 든 거예요. 그래서 스위칭 하자마자 올라가서 이거 잘 들어갔다, 익절 해야지 하고 바로 익절 걸었는데 내 거 익절 바로 위에서 바로 밑에서 지금 빅쇼트 나왔어. 원래는 한 여기쯤 걸려 있었거든요. 이거 좀 내린 건데 여기쯤 걸려 있던 거를 지금은 전고 가면은 털려고 내렸어요. 이거 원래 익절 나가면 바로 스위칭 하려고 그랬는데 또 이걸 체결 안 시켜주네. 더 갈 것 같았는데. 진짜로 내가 자랑하니까 아까 제가 카톡에 올린 거 보셨죠? 단톡방에 야, 나 스위칭해서 바로 스위칭 하자마자 떡상했다, 나 이제 정신 차렸다, 이거 스크린샷 올리자마자 빅쇼트 나왔어요. 그냥 1K가 떨어졌어. 야, 14,000달러가 떨어졌다. 14,000달러. 맨날 내가 뭐 좀 수익 좀 봤다고 좋아하거나 단톡방에 자랑하거나 그러면 그냥 반대로 빅쇼트나 빅롱 나와요. 맨날 그래. 왜 그런지 모르겠다. 이제부터 내가 단톡방에 좋아할 때마다 그냥 바로 익절해야 되겠어요. 아, 클파님 또 와. 나 이거 청산 나갈 것 같은데 근데 모르겠어. 이거를 해결할 때까지 원래 오늘 제가 별로 안 들어가 있었고 시드도 코인 변동성도 없길래 그냥 휴방을 하려고 했는데 쉬려고. 근데 여기서 뭔가 올라갈 것 같아서 제가 좀 과감하게 추매를 좀 크게 때렸어요. 그러고 나서 올라가길래 아, 이거 익절하고 스위칭하면 되겠다 했는데 아, 이거를 체결 안 시켜주네. 원래 여기 위에 있던 거 좀 내린 거긴 하거든요. 근데 바로 밑에였는데 갑자기 내가 단톡방에 자랑하려고 스크린샷 올리자마자 바로 그냥 빅쇼트가 나왔어요. 아, 선절님 1600불? 그 얼마 시작이었죠? 아, 나 진짜 어이가 없네. 진짜 자랑할 때 팔아야 된다는 게 맞는 것 같아요. 단톡방에 스크린샷 올리자마자 바로 떨어졌어. 14,000달러가 떨어졌어요. 계속 올라가다가. 난 맨날 왜 이러냐? 아, 근데 이거 이렇게 되면 평소에 제 관점이었으면 숏을 보고 싶은데 아, 너무 아깝다. 그니까 아, 너무 뜬금없이 떨어졌는데. 아니, 올라갈 때 힘을 보면은 제 거 익절가까지 무난하게 갈 것 같았거든요. 아, 근데 이거를 말아 내려버리네. 파월 등장하려면 잠깐만, 12시라 그랬나요? 이미 등장했나? 아, 파워라. 이것도 연설이 아니라 청문회네요? 아니, 청문회 어제 했잖아.
돌돌이님 너무 감사합니다. 고맙습니다.
One last question. More and more, many companies use algorithms that combine competitors' price information to engage in what they call dynamic pricing or surge pricing. You know that corporate PR teams worked hard on this. Just another way for corporations to make it harder for consumers to seek out lower prices and to pad
그러니까요.
corporate
아,
profits.
어제는 별로
Are you
반응도
concerned
없던데.
that the wide adoption of these price gouging strategies, these pricing schemes, if you will contribute to inflation?
I mean, I think it works both ways. Let me say that, we're well aware of this trend and we're monitoring it. Remember that prices go down when there's no one in the store, and they go up when there are a lot of people. If you're doing dynamic pricing, same thing with the with the ride companies, it works both ways. I don't know that it have implication for, for inflation. It would certainly have implications for consumers who need to be informed.
You think that this kind of surge pricing might lower prices overall?
I mean, that's my understanding is that the idea is that in slow periods, prices actually go down, and in in busy periods they go up.
But these are sophisticated.
그 전에
economists with
변동성 나오면은 나 이거
not
청산이든
gonna do
익절이든
things
나갈 것
to lower their
같은데요.
profits.
I think the price mechanism is incredibly important in our
아,
economy.
조금만
I
더
think,
올라가지.
we need to give
너무
companies the
아깝다.
freedom to do that as long as
저거
they're-
익절
they're
나가면
not
바로
fixing
스위칭하려고
prices
그랬는데
or failing to disclose the nature of the price
음봉
changes
하나
to the
떴을 때
public.
그냥 바로
I've
익절
a few
나갈 걸.
seconds. Research has
그래서
indicated
매번
constraints
느끼는
and
건데
drivers
익절가
behind a
직전에
significant amount of the inflation we've seen over
이렇게
the last
장대
few
음봉
years.
나오면 그냥
If the
거기서
supply
털어야
chain,
돼.
for instance, of autos had been more resilient, or if there had been more housing
네,
availability,
지금 좀 많이
that
들어갔어요.
made your job easier.
플라이트 챌린지니까 크게 들어가야지.
Word.
10,000원 가지고
Yeah,
하는 건데.
but big part of the inflation was
자꾸
and we
익절했어요?
saw it in 2023 when the supply chain problems unwound and when the labor supply
아,
shock
익절했네.
had unwound as well. We saw inflation come down very quickly in the second half.
웬일이냐?
행복음이 안 돼.
Tight monetary policy is playing a role as well.
Which leads me to the
혹시 영어가 되시는 분들 이거 듣고 계시다가 중요한 얘기 나오면 좀 알려주세요. 아니 왜 근데 자꾸 내 거 평단가만 찍고 떨어져 지금?
Oh, I know you are done. That's true.
이거 봐, 또 내 거 평단가만 찍고 떨어졌어.
That would be a nightmare, and I'm awake.
재밌는 얘기했네요. 기업들이 서로 비교하면서 가격을 막 올리는데 그러면은 이제 나중에 물가를 내릴까요? 라고 물어봤는데 파월 연준 의장이 사는 사람이 없어지면은 가격을 내리게 될 겁니다 라고 했습니다. 어디서 많이 통신사 얘기할 때 많이 들어봤던 얘기인 것 같은데.
I can't imagine how the average millennial affords a down payment for a home. I can't imagine how they take into consideration when they're looking at a snapshot of their financial future,
그냥 손절 쳐야 되나?
fixing and
아
repairing,
너무 아까운데.
or having a plan for obsolescence that happens for every homeowner in the country. I think the issue is far more complicated.
절반
I'd
탈까요?
love to delve into that over the next 4
좀 많이 들어가 있기도 해서
But my first
제가
is a combination between
속보 하나
이렇게 불릴
나왔습니다.
때
스웨덴 정부가 나토에
0.017개 막
가입하기로
14개 이렇게
공식
들어갔었거든요.
결정했다고 합니다.
14개 막 이렇게. 근데 지금 26개 들어가 있어가지고 평소보다 2배 좀 크게 잡았어요. 지금까지 잡은 것보다. 총상가 64.8K. 지금 여기서 한번 패대기 꽂으면 그냥 바로 청산이에요. 그냥 하필이면 청문회여가지고. 내가 봤을 때 아까 무빙이면은 오늘 청문회 없었으면 그냥 내 거 익절 나갔다. 그냥 잘 올라가고 있었는데 나스닥은 근데 내려가는가 싶다가 다 말아 올렸거든요 지금. 지금 비트가 아까 나스닥 개장할 때랑 무빙이 비슷했는데 이렇게 올라가다가 떨어졌어. 그때 비트도 같이 떨어졌어요. 근데 지금 반등할 때는 같이 못 가고 있어. 그동안 너무 많이 올랐기 때문에 그런가? 일단 고점까지 뚫었거든요. 파월 등판하고도. 근데 비트는 못 가고 있어. 이러니까 뭔가 애매하죠. 한 번 더 갈 것도 같은데 나스닥이 저렇게 오른 거 보면 다시 근데 이거 완전 내가 평소에 좋아하던 쇼 차트인데. 근데 차트를 보는 것 자체는 이렇게 뭐 지표 발표나 청문회나 연설 이런 거 있을 때는 의미 없는 것 같아요. 괜히 차트 보고 분석하려고 하는데. 저점을 깨면은 손절을 쳐야 될까요?
You have more shoppers, except for these days when you have more folks in the store. Sometimes they're just there to steal.
아 내려간다.
You quoted my statement earlier, and it was an accurate quote for which I thank you. But I would say right before that, what I said was immigration policy, very important, very much under discussion, and it's none of our business. We don't set immigration policy and we don't comment on it. So,
So you commented
손절이
on
맞나?
immigration. So my point though is that when you're going to tell a story, please tell the whole story, especially when the nation.
옛날에는 상점에 사람들이 많으면 물품을 구매하러 왔는데 요즘은 상점에 사람이 많으면 도둑질하러 온대요.
Kind of negative impact on prices, on crime, on the challenges that everyday
이게
Americans,
입절이 안
especially
나냐.
Americans living in the poorest parts of America, face on a daily basis.
그러니까요. 아 저거 털렸어야 됐는데 아 진짜 스트레스
over
받네.
time. So I was referring to the history, which with you agreed. So
겁나
I
웃기네.
was staying as far as I possibly could from the current political context, and you know, it's really not appropriate for us. We're independent. We like to remain that way. And the
뭐가
way we do
이래.
that, one of the ways is by staying
야 근데 나스닥 따라갈 거면 좀 똑바로 따라가지. 내려갈 땐 같이 따라가고 올라갈 때는 왜 안 따라가냐. 내가 롱 잡으니까 이래.
Very real. I don't deny that, but they're really not for us.
So the Fed does not consider the impact.
둘 다
of
죽어라
10 million
올라가다가,
illegal
어?
immigrants coming to our country and the costs
근데 내가 롱
associated with
잡으니까
those illegal
입절가 바로
immigrants.
밑에서 갑자기 나를까.
Consider the impact on states like New York or California. or
한
Illinois,
번쯤은
where
더
the
가줄 것
devastation
같거든요.
of
나스닥
crime
상태를
ravaging the
보니까.
poorest Americans has an impact. We don't take
좋은데?
that into consideration.
So you know, we do.
솔직히
and so does the
비트코인
Congressional
고점 찍고
Budget
떨어질
Office. We
때도
do try to
나스닥
estimate
따라간
the
경향이 좀
population, try to
있는데
estimate the effect of immigration,
나스닥은 그때
legal
고점을 거의
available on the size of
회복했어요.
the workforce, and on GDP. If you look at the Congressional Budget Office has, as you probably know, a
비트
detailed
날아갈 때가
assessment of all of
이건데
things like that.
뭐
We don't
더블
really have a
바텀
way,
찍고
and we do look at the finances in the aggregate of state and local governments. That's in the
한 번
hiring
더
that
갈
they
것
do.
같은데.
So that's something we look at, but we wouldn't do a very specific assessment like
근데
that.
청산가까지
CBO would probably
버티면 안 돼.
we
이거는
wouldn't do that.
저점을 깨거나 했을 때 제가 손절을 쳐야 될 것 같아요.
This has got Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my questions, I want to celebrate that
지금
in the
입절해도
past
난
year we
뭐
have seen
나쁘지
the
않아요.
first Latino Federal Reserve Governor and the first
지금
ever
손절해도
Latino
입절이야. 이거
Federal
만원 가지고
Reserve
시작한
Bank
거니까.
president. These are historic milestones that show we are finally making progress, something that I have been at for quite some time, to the leadership of our economic institutions. So I want to applaud that. And Mr. Chairman, I hope that progress can continue and extend to the rest of the Federal Reserve staff.
Thank you.
I agree with my friend, the ranking member, that when you tell a story, you should tell the whole story. Mr. Chairman, are you aware of the Washington Post February 27th article that says the economy is roaring and immigration is a key reason?
I don't recall that, but I would have read it.
Let me read it to you. Immigration has propelled the U.S. job market further than just about anyone
저 마실 거 좀 가져올게요.
helping cement the country's economic rebound from the pandemic as the most robust in the world. It goes on to say, economists and labor experts say the surge in employment was ultimately key to solving unprecedented gaps in the economy that threatened the country's ability to recover.
아 오늘 머리도 아프고 나 일찍 잘라 그랬는데
Would you take issue with those statements?
You know, there are a lot of adjectives and adverbs in there that you wouldn't see in Fed world. But the
Take out the adjectives and give me on the
yeah,
substance.
the story is I think broadly that it is that there was a very significant increase in the size of the workforce last year, and it was happening all during the year, and we were wondering what it was, and the answer was it was really two things. It was labor force participation, but it was also immigration. And if you look at the Congressional Budget Office numbers, it kind of makes sense because there was a lot of growth. Wages were coming down. The economy is bigger, and those are probably
일단은 딱히
part effect. This is
코인이랑
without making
영향이
any
있을 것
judgments on
같은 얘기는 안
immigration or
하는 것
immigration
같은데.
policy, but I think that's an
I'm
economic
not
fact.
suggesting that. I'm just suggesting the facts are
Yep.
that we had 10 or 11 million jobs that were going unfulfilled in our economy. They lacked the productivity that is necessary for success economically. And as part of that, clearly, immigration helped fuel part of our revival coming out of the pandemic. In fact, those were the people who were the essential workers when the rest of us were staying home. So I agree we need to do
일단은 그냥
what's
두고
necessary to have
있을게요.
a regularized border. But I also think that just to create
내려간다 싶으면 손절할게.
the context of immigration.
이거 봐 나스닥 올라가는 거 봐.
is
안
absolutely.
내려가잖아.
Let me turn to another question. In my view, the sticky inflation we've been seeing in the housing sector is
아, 씨, 왜
principally
이러냐,
due to the
비트는.
massive nationwide housing shortage. The Fed's monetary policy report attributes the shortage to restrictive zoning, high interest rates, and tighter underwriting by banks. I would also add to that list underfunding of key HUD programs that shore up and expand our supply of affordable housing. If the housing supply shortage continues to grow, are we likely to see continued housing inflation?
Yes, we are.
And housing is already becoming less and less affordable for low and middle-income Americans. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's 2023 Out of Reach report, a worker earning the minimum wage in New Jersey would have to work 2 full-time jobs to afford a modest one-bedroom rental home at fair market rent. Do you agree that increasingly unaffordable housing is a problem for the economy?
I think there are two things going on. One is a longer-term housing shortage, and the other is the pandemic effects and the associated higher interest rates, which are things that will pass through. When all that passes through and rates are normalized, we'll still have the underlying housing shortage, and it's going to be causing upward pressure on housing prices.
Now, the monetary policy report noted that, quote, home purchases by low-income households have fallen disproportionately more because mortgage lenders impose maximums on the ratio of a borrower's debt service payments to the borrower's income. I'm worried about how this dynamic will interact with the recently proposed capital requirements proposal, which, according to analysis from the Urban Institute, would disproportionately increase the cost of mortgages for Black, Hispanic, and low and income moderate borrowers. Given this, isn't there a risk that if the capital rules implemented without changes, that it could make it even harder for disadvantaged borrowers to attain home ownership?
There is a risk like that, and we're very focused on it.
And hopefully you're working to mitigate it.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Chairman. Senator Rounds from South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, welcome back. Look, first of all, I've appreciated the way that you've approached the discussions in front of this committee, and I understand your desire to stay as neutral as possible with regard to the politics involved in an election year. But I do have some questions here, specifically with regard to the Basel III Endgame proposal. An analysis of that proposal
다시 가자.
found that 97% were either opposing it or expressing substantial concerns. In the hearing last March on the Monetary Policy Report, you stated that the Federal Reserve is a consensus organization, and you said, and I quote, I will do everything I can possibly to bring people together in consensus
너무
and have a
아깝네.
capital framework that could be broadly supported.
내 것만 딱
My question
체결시켜주고
to that
내려갔어.
is, do you currently believe that there is a
정확하게
consensus on this
28K에
capital
아니
framework?
68K에서
I
내려간
believe
것도
that we
좀
will have one. I'm fairly
찝찝하지
confident
않나요?
that we will have such a consensus when we do move forward.
So we could expect that you will probably not call a vote on the proposal until you believe that there is a consensus?
I think that's right. I mean, we're just in the process of digesting the comments and then making the appropriate changes.
Thank you. As you are aware, I've weighed in several times on the concerns that I have with regard to Basel III Endgame, including I'm concerned about the lack of transparency, the negative effects on mortgage lending and home affordability by disincentivizing banks from offering high loan-to-value loans that primarily help first-time home buyers and low to moderate income borrowers. I'm concerned that the proposal will make buying a home harder than it already is for many. And further down the road, I fear that it could disincentivize mortgage lending from the largest banks, particularly with regard to the secondary market and their impact on even smaller banks that do business with them. Would you be willing to withdraw the proposal or re-propose with significant modifications, particularly addressing the concerns that I and others have?
아니, 왜
on this
어제는
committee,
가만히 있다가
raising
오늘
specifically
이래?
with regard to the impact, and I'm thinking of Freddie and Fannie in particular, and what the impact might be. What would you see as the process involving those particular issues?
So on those issues, we're well aware of and very focused on those issues. We haven't decided what to do about that yet, but we get it on those issues. In terms of process, we're not at the stage of making that decision. I will say, if it turns out to be appropriate when we get to that point for us to repropose parts or all of the thing, then we won't hesitate to do so.
Okay, thank you. Makes me feel a little bit better because I do think there are some very serious problems that would occur if the Basel III Endgame as proposed goes into effect. And I most certainly am hoping that the Federal Reserve will find a consensus on this. And it sounds like that may very well include some significant modifications if it were to be brought at all. Is that a fair statement?
I expect there will be material and broad changes to the proposal before it comes back to the committee for consideration, the board for consideration.
Thank you, sir.
네, 맞아요. 그것도 봤어요. 그거 영향이 좀 있는 것 같은데. 그거 거기에다가 그레이 스케일도 비트 몇 개 던지려고 보냈대요. 코인베이스에. 아까 뉴스 보니까 네, 여기 그레이 스케일 추정 주수 코인베이스 프라임으로 3억 BTC 3억 달러 상당 입금.
But it is well known that
3억 달러면
I really
BTC
do
몇
believe
개지?
that high inflation and high prices have been a direct result of President Biden's policies, failed in many cases, that the Federal Reserve has limited
3억 달러면 4,470개거든요.
반만님, 몽도님 감사합니다. 너무 고맙습니다.
아, 숏이 맞는 것 같은데.
What have been some of the unintended consequences from raising the federal
네.
funds rate as rapidly
그레이 스케일에다가 어떤 익명까지.
What are some of those? I know that we talked a little bit about SVP and the failure there, their inability to look at treasuries and the
근데 내가 지금까지 봤을 때 저렇게 대놓고 보낼 때는 그렇게까지 크게 떨어진 적 없는 것 같은데.
코인 쪽 얘기도 하나만 나오면 될 것 같은데.
High interest rates are hard for
안 나와?
businesses. They're hard for people. They're the thing they're the tool that we have to use to bring inflation down. And our job at this time, when high inflation comes, it is the Fed's job to restore price stability, and that's what we're doing.
네, 양전.
You point to the losses in banks. That was a very substantial thing, and obviously the supervisors. And that was us.
오늘 이거 익절 나가면
didn't get to that problem. We were aware of
포지션
it,
없이
but we
그냥
didn't
잘게요.
probably appreciate it enough.
아, 제
Another
목소리가
자고 일어나서
들려요?
내일 봐야 될 거.
is that we were able to get this far
익절하든가
with
아니면
inflation
손절을
down
쳤을 때
this quickly
그냥
without
지켜봐야
일부러
될
크게
거.
얘기하는
in
건데.
unemployment. And that's just
레버리지도 너무
that's
높고.
just a surprise. It's not
일단은
consistent with
양전했어요.
historical record, but it's a really positive thing.
Thank you. And I would just know that the only tools you had available were demand side tools.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Senator Warner of Virginia is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, it's great to see you. I would point out to my good friend from South Dakota.
아니 그게
I
아니고.
do think, if we
그러니까 이 목소리에 묻혀서 제 목소리가 안 들리는 줄 알고 크게 얘기한 건데 이 정도로 해도 연설보다 제 목소리가 들리신다면 상관없어요.
some of the things, like the CHIPS bill, the infrastructure bill, and some of President Biden's policies have actually kept the
확인.
economy growth rate at the levels that have allowed you to bring down inflation without seeing a dramatic rise in unemployment. And again, that'll be something we'll probably have the
그래요?
opportunity to
감사합니다.
litigate over the next 8 or 9 months. I want to take my time on issues around less about monetary policy and more about regulation. I think we can never presume that we're out of the woods on financial stability, as we saw with the New York Community Bank yesterday, the stock plunge and the capital infusion. One area that I raised with you a year ago, I want to re-raise
춤에.
today, and that is non-bank
올라간다 이거.
lending, non-bank lending in terms of to non-financial.
아, 상패님 어서 오세요.
Exceeding
그래, 다들
regulated
도망쳐.
bank lending.
뚜띠가 롱 잡았다.
The non-bank financial sector has done productive things in our
드디어
society
뚜띠가
over the
롱을
years.
잡았어요.
But when folks like
지금 올라가야 돼.
former Fed
아, 나
President
아까
Dudley and former
숏 잡고
Fed
있다가
Grosvenor recently
여기서
said
올라갈
that,
것 같아요. 저 스위칭 하자마자 바로 쐈거든요.
정책 관련 내용
그래서
얘기하고
입절을
있습니다.
걸었는데 내 거
정책적인
책을
내용.
안 시켜주고 내려갔어.
정책적인 내용.
아니 내가 단톡방에다가 이거 자랑하려고 스크린샷 찍고 올리자마자 갑자기 1K가 떨어지는 거야.
push out effect of more and more lending going outside the regulated perimeter to the non-bank.
이게 아까는 여기 걸려 있었거든요.
How much do we really
그렇게
know about these?
솔직히 이 정도면 체결시켜 줄만 했지. 거의 $100, $150 차이였는데
They have
일단은
very
전고점으로
smart,
바꿨어요.
sophisticated
어찌할까?
정책 관련된 내용
올라가죠.
얘기하니까 말씀드리면은 일단은 가장 편한
변동성 커서
방법은
이거 다시 올라갈 수도 있어요. 지금
일단 요거
아까
제가
나스닥
왼쪽에
떨어질 때
쓰는
같이
거
떨어졌는데
펴놓으시던지 아니면 라디오 모드
나스닥은 다시
해놓으시면
올랐거든요.
제가 정말 중요한 얘기 할 때는 마이크로 추가로 언급을 해드립니다.
banking system where you've got a lot of
지금
transparency,
올라가야
you've got
돼.
deposit insurance, you've got access to
올라간다. 오케이.
the discount window and all those things.
지금 추매하고 싶은데 좀만 참을게요.
If you
지금
go
추매
outside
더하면
that, most of
청사가
the
너무
funding that we see now in
가까워져가지고
these vehicles is
지금 청사가
sophisticated investors who are
65K
actually
거든요.
limited partners, meaning they can't pull their money out. They're
달러
signed a
인덱스 좀
contract,
하락
they're funded these
중이고요.
deals.
비트코인
And so
ETF는
what you see now
비트코인 얘기하고
오른쪽으로
있어?
계속 흘러가고
is
있습니다.
significant
비트
아,
도미넌스도
that
좀
kind of thing. So it
미묘하고
doesn't have the
이더리움도
run
체크 한번
risk.
해보시고
The
달러
point is, the
인덱스도
bigger it
계속
grows,
떨어지고
the
있는데
more diverse it gets.
이러면
It is
올라가줘야
happening
되는데.
outside the regulatory perimeter, and you worry that
올라갈 만한데 지금
when there is
나스닥도
another
내린 거 다시 다
crisis,
올렸고.
you'll be
이거
surprised
봐.
that there will be ways that
아까 비트가
financial
내려갈 때
structure
이거였어요.
too can break down.
이거
It does
따라간
break
거야.
down in ways we don't anticipate.
다 말아
So
올렸잖아.
I think we need to be smart about the way about
근데 솔직히 차트가 내가 평소 같았으면 쫓아봤을 차트이긴 해요.
Non-bank financial institutions. That's what's been happening for a long time. I just think we need to be thoughtful about understanding where the risks are emerging.
And that sophisticated investor may rightfully say, "Hey, we don't want you to lend anymore for a X period of time," but that may
네,
then
제가
at
좋아하는
that
쇼 차트.
moment of crisis
이렇게 올라가는 척하다가 빠지는 거.
mean that the
크게
lending
빠지는 거.
capabilities completely dry up. And
상호
one of the things I
지느러미.
never completely understood until I got a little better
근데
explanation
내가
was
평소에 그때
why
쇼
the
쳐가지고
large
먹었어?
regulated banks
어떻게
weren't more
됐어요?
complaining about this non-bank lending, but
네?
as I got to understand a little bit more of the, and again, I'm not per se
그러니까
criticizing the
셀프
non-bank
또방꾸를
lending,
한번
but
해보자고.
many of the regulated
평소에
banks
나
actually
같았으면
lend
쇼
to these
잡았을
large
쇼
institutions, so they
잡았을
make,
차트인데
they
이럴
make
때
money
롱
off
한번
of those
잡아봐야지.
relationships, and maybe that's again an explanation of why they're not being more critical. I only got 40 seconds left, but I would like to
올라간다,
come
이거.
back to another thing that we've
근데
talked
원래
about a lot,
제가 롱을 잡은 건 여기에요.
and that is the question of
잘 잡았는데
use of the discount window.
그냥 딱 1K만 먹고 나갈 걸.
One of the original tools that the Fed had. I know banks say, well, we're concerned about the stigma.
할인
원래는
창구
지금 평단이 더
얘기도
낮았거든요.
나오고 있고요. 일단은
mandatory use of the
아직까지는 엄청 중요한 거는 안
And also
나왔습니다.
just the idea that
자꾸 내거
having the
평단가 근처에서
mechanics of
깔짝거리네.
the discount window open, potentially even 24/7, because we saw with SVB, they didn't know how to use it, but two, if they wanted to use it in the non-bank hours, could they get access?
There's a lot of work to do on the discount window. You're absolutely right. It needs to be brought up technologically into the modern age. We need to do more to eliminate the stigma problem, and we need to make sure that banks are actually able to use it when they need to use it. And those things. That's a broad work program that we're on right now, and it's very important.
I know you're
그렇지.
working on it, but I would look forward to working more, and I'd invite other colleagues. I really
자.
do think before we start adding a whole host
이게
of other
1K가
regulatory
옛날 1K가 아니라서
issues, we
여기까지
gotta use some of
올라가는
the
거
tools
일도
that are
아니에요.
out there. You're not gone. So
God, I just checked in at the Veterans Committee. Senator Tillis, North Carolina. Thank you, Mark.
I was about to take control, Senator Warner. Welcome, Chair Powell, and Gus sends his regards. If you have time after the hearing, you ought to go by and see him. He's
아,
at,
진성님 어서
office,
오세요.
but,
I don't want to disturb his nap.
와.
But thank you for being here. I want to get back on this Basel III proposal. Senators Lummis, Coons, Gillibrand, and I sent a letter indicating our concerns with the current proposal. But I think it's also worth noting that the number of other organizations, a diverse group that are not normally aligned on policy. You got Bank Trades, National Housing Conference, NAACP, Habitat for Humanity,
TV요?
National Community
지금
Reinvestment
들어오셨어요.
Coalition, the list goes on, who have concerns
아,
with the current
유튜브?
proposal. Here's my concern. I
유튜브에
think
그냥
we're
또띠TV 치면 안
trying to
나오나?
make the best of what was foundationally a
아,
bad
단톡방이요?
proposal. And so
단톡방
I'm in
그거
the category
단톡방
of
검색하는
people who
곳에서
think that it should
오픈
be
채팅방에서
reproposed, because I think
또띠TV
one of the
단톡방
reasons
검색하시면
why
그냥
I
나와요.
did not support Mr. Barr's
아, 왜또
nomination is
떨어지나?
I felt like we were going to be here. I mean, it was pretty clear to me before he ever got confirmed on the board that we were going to be in this place some months or years later. And here we are. And I think that the industry felt the same way. All of these stakeholders. Some of them are in banking trade. Some of them are on the other side of the spectrum. So I'd like to cast my vote or provide some weight to the idea that we should propose it. And what we ought to do is talk about the reality of increasing capital, or the prospect of increasing capital requirements doesn't concern me. I think the prior Fed supervisor had made comments publicly that maybe we needed to raise capital standards. But what we did here in this proposal, and I heard in that dialogue, is let's deal with puts and takes. Let's talk about raising capital requirements, but let's also talk about reducing the cost of the regulatory burden today if we can do it responsibly. There's no evidence of that in the current
자본 요구 사항에 대한 내용입니다. 자본을 더 요구하는 걸로 바꾸면서 은행들이 하나둘씩 좀 흔들리고 있죠, 지금. Capital requirement.
So over what time horizon do you think we would expect to either see try to make the best of this foundation or go back and take a look at a new foundation and repropose it?
You know, we're going to work through it as quickly as we can and should. I will say it's more important to get it right than it is to do it fast. We're not in a hurry. But my guess is we'll
진성님 지금 스페이스 아이디 들어가 있어요? 저거 코인 이름 아닌가? 이거 빗썸에서 본 것 같은데? 그쵸? 1,000원 찍었네? 오, 야, 야, 뭐야? 업비트에도 있어요? 좀 버셨겠는데? 평단이 어떻게 돼요?
Chastising manufacturers for creating smaller portion sizes for potato chips. I'll use that as one example. But if you have rising input cost,
한 11% 정도 드셨네.
you're not able to control that, and you're in a margin
짜모가 시드예요?
and now you're saying you can't even reduce.
제 시드 보세요,
How does a
진성님.
business that's not making a profit make that work?
You know, I mean, we see
지금
inflation as
10,000원으로 매매하고 있는 사람도 있는데.
as a mismatch between supply and demand. And as we've seen supply get better,
지금 10,000원으로 플라이트 챌린지 하고 있거든요.
it was very hot.
지금 10만 원.
Pandemic, we see inflation coming down.
We saw food inflation between 2010 and 2021 at 18% over 11 years.
네, 선물은 위험해요.
Over the last 3 years, we've seen it at 20%.
부장인데 굳이 선물할 필요가 없는 것 같아.
I think that we have a
특히나 원래 현물을 하고 있던 사람이 굳이 선물을 할 필요가 없어. 그냥 불장이니까 레버리지 땡겨가지고 롱 들어가면 내가 돈을 더 벌 수 있지 않을까 하고 선물판 들어왔다가 대부분 죽어요. 저도 그랬고.
But I have a question. I think the chair mentioned, and if I misunderstood this, I'm sure the chair will clarify. But I thought in his opening comments, he suggested that stock buybacks and paying out dividends were a key factor in inflation.
2년 전에 선물하셨었어요?
Policy see stock buybacks and dividends is one of the top 5 reasons we're experiencing the inflation we have right now.
네, 저도 그랬어요.
First, I guess I see stock
저는 21년도?
same thing in a different form. And I don't know.
처음에 18년도 뭐 저도 18년도 17년도 이때 시작해가지고 불장에 좀 이렇게 불리고 했던 현물 돈들 21년도쯤인가 부처빔 나와가지고 반토막 났을 때 이거 반토막 난 거 선물로 어떻게 좀 멘징을 해보자 이러고 보냈다가 싸그리 날렸죠 그냥. 그때는 뭣도 모르고 알트코인 5 빼면 안전하지 않나? 청산당할 일 없겠지? 들어갔는데 그냥 바로 그냥 하락장 딱 시작되니까 알트코인 5배 청산당하는 거 일도 아니더라고요. 비트코인 5배였으면 또 모르겠는데 알트코인 5배는 금방 청산 당해. 아마 선물판 들어온 사람들 한 80%는 저랑 비슷할 거예요. 불장 때 돈 좀 벌었다가 뭐 부처빔 아니면 하락장 그때 잃어가지고 그거 멘징하려고 선물판 들어갔다가 남은 돈까지 싹 다 청산.
leaving us really no closer to addressing the affordability crisis that I think that we have, and this was there well before the pandemic. Shortly before the Fed began tightening, Chair Powell, and you came before the committee, I asked you about how higher interest rates could exacerbate this unaffordability problem that we have by making mortgages more expensive and also hindering housing development. And I think that at the time you argued that we have a excess housing demand during the pandemic, and that was kind of at the root of higher costs, and that your goal, the Fed's goal, was to bring
그걸로 크게
demand
맞아서
closer
이제
in line with supply. So my first question
복구하려고
is this.
선물
So the
들어갔다가
housing market has cooled significantly over the last
네.
2 years. Is it your view that it has cooled enough so that housing supply and demand is better in balance? And following on
그러면
that,
그
given the
다음부터는
Fed's
선물 안
limited
하고 있어요?
tools, understanding that,
현물만?
at what point will you think that you've done all that you can to lower housing demand? My view is that we're well past time in Congress to take action on the housing supply side, but I'm interested in how you see this dynamic.
So we're not focused so much on housing and housing inflation. We're really focused on the aggregate, which is also
네.
goods and not housing services. That's way more.
아,
than half
코인
of
자체를 안 하고
the inflation.
있다가
The
다시
thing-
현물 쪽만.
There are things in the housing
선물은
sector
하지
that,
마세요.
that we didn't fully anticipate.
그거
One of
선물
was-
끄는
one of them
것만으로도
was that
잘한
people
거지.
in very low interest rate homes with very low interest rate mortgages
선물을 끄는
aren't
것만으로도
selling.
고수야.
So the
대부분
quantity of homes that's
선물에서 청산을 당하고
That's
나면
why very little
현물로는
of
어떻게
existing
다시
home
시작해야
sales.
될지 좀
And that drives
막막하거든요.
up existing home sale prices, but also new home sale prices. So
그래서 결국엔 또
again, there's two
선물에
sets
돈
of
넣고
factors.
또
There's the
선물에
longer
돈
run
넣고
issue,
그렇게
but then there's
되더라고요.
the factors
저도
associated with
그랬고.
the pandemic and the inflation and our
아,
response.
그때
to it.
청산당했어요?
I think as the overall
담배 피러
inflation
갔다가?
continues to come down and rates then come down, you'll see the housing market start to heal and get better, and housing affordability should go up again.
몇
You're still
배로
gonna be left
들어가셨길래
with-
그때?
with the longer term problem of supply.
Right.
아까 말한 시스코인이 그 선물로 들어갔던 코인이에요? 선물도 그걸로 하셨어요? 선물은 비트로? 아니면 다른 알트코인? 네.
And so there's sort of this double whammy of construction slowing at the
아니
same time that there is
여기
this,
채팅이 나와. 오늘 여기 채팅을 왜 풀어놨지? 난리가 났네.
이더로?
컷 레이트 하이크 레이트 컷 하이크 하이크 컷 하이크 컷 하이크 컷 바이 셀
뭐야?
바이 셀 골드 바이 올 셀 바이 골드 올 셀 골드 all sell gold. 난리가 났네.
아, 큰 돈은
역시
아니었어요?
한국이 전 세계가
그러면
똑같아요, 그렇죠? 저희 보니까 무슨
저는
이상한
좀 큰 돈이었거든요.
이상한 코인 사라는 애들도 있고.
감당이 안 될 정도로 큰 돈이었어가지고. 아, 아직도 이 바닥을 못 벗어나고 있어요.
중국 주식 사래요. 14년 최하라고. 그랬더니 닥치라고 하고.
네.
재밌네.
중간중간 현물 했다가도 이게 선물하다 보니까 다 그냥 선물에 꼬라박게 되더라고요. 여기가 늪이야, 늪. 선물하면 안 돼. 현물을 못 하겠어요. 내가 차라리 21년도에 선물로 박살 나고 나서 그냥 현물로 했다? 그때라도 내가 인정을 하고 현물을 했다? 지금까지 내가 선물에 꼬라박은 돈을 현물을 했으면 이렇게 불장이 왔을 때라도 내가 돈을 좀 벌었겠죠. 솔직히 이번에 뭐 예전처럼 다 같이 올라간 건 아닌데 불장이라고 해서 잘 간 것들은 솔직히 10배도 갔잖아요. 다 복구했지 그러면.
Chairman, thank you for being here. Thank you for your services. I think I've
이게 뭔 꼴이냐.
said before.
애초에 뭐 선물을 시작을 안 했다 그러면은 내가 하락장에 반토막이 났다고 해도
economy during the pandemic.
그냥 기껏해야 반토막이고 지금까지 들고 있었으면 불장에 또 복구를 했겠죠. 근데 선물은 그게 안 돼. 내가 크게 틀렸을 때 감당이 안 돼요.
Mr. Chairman, on February 4th of this year,
현물도 뭐 가끔씩 상패를 당하거나 루나코인 같은 것도 나오기는 하는데 그거는 정말 재수가 없는 경우. 그런 건 뭐 주식에서도 나오는 거고. 솔직히 상장 폐지 같은 거의 위험성에 대해서는 코인이 훨씬 나은 것 같아요. 주식보다. 상장 폐지를 주식이 더 많이 하지 않나? 애초에 코인은 정말 업비트에만 있는 그런 업비트 김치 코인이 아니고서는 상장 폐지를 당해도 반토막 정도만 나오고 끝나더라고요, 거의. 해외 거래소에도 많이 상장되어 있는 코인이면 어느 정도 살아남아. 저번에 상장 폐지했던 그 위믹스는 오히려 더 많이 올랐던데요. 업비트 상장 폐지하고 나서. 개떡상했던데 그것도. 이게 주식 같은 경우에는 거래소 한 번 상장 폐지되면은 사실상 휴지 조각이고 정말로 끝인데 코인은 어떻게든 살아남을 그 구석이 있어. 상패 당한다고 해도 솔직히 반토막은 건질 수 있고 내가 포기를 빠르게 하면. 네, 요즘에 신규 코인들이 잘 나가더라고요.
홈페이지
AI
가시면
관련
나와요.
코인들이라.
상원.
일단 다시 올라가고 있는데 익절가 거의 다 왔거든요. 아까 제가 여기서 들어갔는데 원래 숏 들고 있다가 여기서 뭔가 올라갈 것 같은 느낌을 대놓고 풍기길래 바로 스위칭하고 레버리지 좀 땡겨서 좀 크게 들어갔는데 올라가다가 내 거 체결 안 시켜주고 갑자기 1K가 떨어졌어. 와, 이거 단톡방에 제가 자랑글을 올렸거든요. 야, 나 스위칭 하자마자 떡상했다. 좀만 더 있으면 익절이다 하고 코인 단톡방에 자랑글을 올렸는데 야, 그 스크린샷 올리자마자 1K가 떨어지더라고. 진짜 스크린샷 찍을 때 팔아야 된다는 게 맞는 것 같아요. 내가 스크린샷 찍고 어디다가 올리고 싶다? 그때 팔아야 돼. 아, 원래 저거 익절하고 나서 바로 스위칭 하려고 그랬는데. 근데 평소 같았으면 제가 슈져봤을 자리긴 해요. 네, 솔직히 지금 파월이 연설하고 있어가지고 연설이 아니라 그 청문회 하고 있어가지고 이럴 때는 뭐 차트 분석 같은 게 거의 의미가 없죠. 그냥 독박이야 이거는. 아하, 그럼 코인에 얼마나 친 거예요? 2년? 지금은 일단 딱히 중요한 얘기는 없는 것 같은데요. 네, 뭐 부동산 얘기 조금 하다가 딱히 뭐 코인이나 금리 같은 직접적인 얘기는 없는 것 같은데. 퀀텀 5만 6만에서 타고 있었으니까
FDIC
그거는 다
이슈입니다.
팔고 나서 쉬셨던 거예요?
FDIC에서 승진하려고 이제 성상납하고 막 좀 FDIC가 좀 미친 짓을 좀 했었어요. 그래가지고 그것 때문에 지금 그냥 그쪽 관련해서 이제 정치적으로 압박하려고 하는 것
퀀텀이 5만
같습니다.
원일 때면 얼마지? 언제지? 지금이 6천 원인데? 6만 원 할 때? 에? 야, 퀀텀이 10만 원을 갔었어? 야,
이제 FDIC에서 나온 내용입니다. FDIC에서 너 지금 벗고 있으면은 너 해버린다 막 이런 식으로 막 미친 소리를 엄청 많이 했어요. 그래가지고 FDIC 뒤집어졌던 건 아시죠? 네, 그래가지고 무슨 뭐 막 뭐도 있더라 뭐 똥도 먹이고 막 그랬다는 걸로 알고 있는데.
에? 뭔 얘기하는 거야 저거?
이제 오줌인가 똥인가 막 그러면서 막 거기 와 FDIC 완전 미친 사람들 소굴이었던 걸로 좀 위쪽은
FDIC가 뭐지?
똥이 예.
미국 연방 예금 보험 공사? 여기서 뭐 똥 먹이고 고문하고 그랬다는데요.
monologue of
Well, you did 6 minutes. I timed it.
I asked my
You did 6 minutes.
Senator Kennedy for months. I have let you
야.
go way over the 5 minutes. You get your question. You're
But you did 6 minutes.
코인 얘기는
너
요즘에 안 한 지가 좀
근데 왜
돼가지고
나는
어제도
5분만
청문했는데 딱히 코인 얘기는 없었대요.
Check the record.
I'm going to order you're going to be at 6.
오늘은 나올 거라고 생각해서 변동성이 좀 있는 건가?
Well,
Or
that's,
you're going to ask your question.
I'll ask my question. I just wanted the record to be clear, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in light of these allegations, if they're proven, how can the FDIC lead this charge for Basel Endgame 3, which is going to turn the banking community upside down?
I don't know how I would make the connection to Basel III. I'll say it's deeply troubling things, obviously, but again, you know, as your point was, if proven. And I mean, I think we have to decide Basel III on its merits, and we're not looking to the FDIC to lead this, by the way. We're looking at the Fed to do what the Fed thinks is right. That's what we're going to do. We don't look to, and they don't look to us to lead them.
곧 있으면
Senator
1시네.
Powell, Senator Butler is recognized.
1시에도 펀비 정산할 때 좀 움직일 것 같은데.
Senator Butler is recognized.
Thank you so much, Chair and Chair Powell. Good to see you in person, and thanks for the time to talk. I want to pick up a little bit where Senator Smith was in relationship to housing affordability, and hopefully draw a little bit on the point that you were making about rents. It definitely is an important crisis in my state of California, and I know across the country. Where, at least according to the California Department
나가야
of Housing
되나,
and
이거?
Urban Development, renters in San Diego are paying about 50%
저도
of
그러고는
what
싶은데,
is, spending more than
저도 그러고
50% of what is
싶은데.
considered affordable and statewide.
난
Majority of
1억만
renters,
벌어도
more than 3
좋겠다.
million households, are spending more than 30%
네, 저는
towards
시드가 너무
rent.
작아서
Nearly 1/3, more than 1 in 5 million
원래
households spend more than
300달러 가지고
50%
하다가
of their
그거
income
청산당해가지고
towards
저번에
rent.
비트 고점
일단은
뚫을 때
움직임은 어제랑 좀 비슷하네요.
그래서 남은
어제도 파월 나오기
7달러로
전에
고배 챌린지
한
하고
2,000불
있거든요.
가까이 떨궜다가 내용 자체 별로
아,
없으니까
근데 또 소액
부정적인
가지고
내용이
고배
조금
챌린지 하니까
말아
또
올렸다고
10배를
치면 오늘도 일단은
먹었어.
무빙 조금 비슷하게 가져가고 있습니다.
정작 본시드로 할 때는 청산당하고. 왜 맨날 이러냐. 아, 또 내려간다 이거. 본절 가면은 털어야겠죠? 지금 탈까?
I don't know that we're affecting the supply of affordable housing if you think of affordable housing as something that's connected.
아, 네, 감사합니다, 진성님.
We don't. That's not our bailiwick.
페이스
I
아이디
mean, clearly interest rates do affect the affordability of housing.
분위기는 진짜 좋네요.
And there was a key point that you made in an earlier
페페 쌓여?
I think reference about
아,
your
근데
response
비트
to
왜 이러지?
Senator Smith about
조금만
the
더 올라가면
monetary
됐는데 또
policy
떨어지네.
and calculation of rents. Can you
털어야
just
될
add a
것
couple-
같은데.
just briefly talk
페페.
about that. I
야,
one
페페
more
미쳤다,
question
진짜.
I want to get to before I run out of time.
얜
It's
죽을
hard to-
생각을 안 하네요.
It's actually very conceptually challenging to think about housing inflation. Do you include the costs of financing it? Do you include the sale price?
아,
The answer
스페이스
is no.
아이디.
We convert ownership into an imputed rent. and that's
이거
two
지금
thirds of
약간
homes are owned.
1,000원을 강하게
And
뚫고
we
나서
measure rents, but,
리테스트 하는
leases
것
only
같지
turn
않나요?
over once a year, so
여기도 보면은
the
1,000원에서
market
좀 이렇게
rents,
맞고 떨어지다가
you know, what's happening with newly signed leases
뚫고
is very
나서
different from what was happening a year ago.
지지
So
받고
it's
이렇게.
complicated, but the good thing
이렇게
is
가면 제일
we
베스트인데.
understand all that and we look through that. We look at housing services overall as
익절하셨으면
three
좋겠네요.
important categories along with non-housing services
딱 너무
and
깔끔한데?
inflation.
차트가?
Thank you for that. And I in the
저항
line of
받던데
affordability
뚫고
and housing,
리테스트
you know,
한번 조지고
very
그러고
general, I
다시.
think, to the broad monetary policy and state of our economy and unique to California.
뭐야.
And I raised this with Secretary
아,
Yellen
내 거
when she
평단가
was
갔다 왔네?
here,
이번에
as
올라갈 것
well.
같다.
The, insurance
춤에 한 번만
gaps that
조질게요.
are presenting themselves due to the impact of climate change. And we're one in five.
그러고 이제 내 거 평단가에다가 절반 스탑로스
별 얘기
걸어야겠다.
안 하고 있습니다. 하우징이고 냉정하게 조금 안타까운 사실이 흑인 분들이 나오면은 조금
절반 스탑
쉬어가는
걸었어요.
타이밍이긴 해요. 질문 자체가 꼭
아, 스페이스 아이디 말고 샌드박스 플로우?
인종 관련된 내용이라서 이 사람도 지금
스페이스
블랙
아이디가
커뮤니티가 지금
메인이고?
하우징 주택 이슈
네,
때문에
50배예요.
고통받는
50배인데
내용이라고 해서
풀시드 들어간 건 아니고
별로 그렇게
지금
일단은 조용합니다.
한
조금
3분의 2 정도 들어갔어요.
아 근데 진짜 이번에
그러니까 한 30배 정도 되는
통과되고
거죠.
나서 무조건 한번 나올 줄 알았는데
플로우 오랜만에
한 번쯤은
듣는다.
나올 텐데
플로우.
언제 나올라나? 아직 2시간 정도 있긴 한데
아, 지금 안 올라가는 코인이 없네요.
이제
그러니까
제도권안에
내가
들어왔기
현물을
때문에
했으면 이런 거라도 먹었겠지. 뭐 현물 뭘 들어가든 먹었을 텐데.
아 형규님 감사합니다. 고맙습니다.
근데 선물을 하잖아요. 내가 이렇게 잘 올라가는 알트코인을 타고 있다가도 너무 많이 올랐는데? 숏으로 한번 먹어볼까? 하고 숏 들어갔다가 청산당해.
Senator, Senator Vance of Ohio is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and my
그러니까요.
gratitude to you and the
원래
rest of
내가
the
현물
panel.
했으면 그냥 가만히
Thank you,
존버했을
Chairman Powell.
사람도
It's good to see you again.
선물을 하게 되는 순간
These
괜히
hearings always very
이게 너무 많이
important
올라가면은
to sort of provide some
많이
oversight,
벌잖아요.
to
그러면은
what's going on with the Fed, better
그만큼
understand some of the
뭔가
things that
빼야
you're
될 것
doing that
같다는
affect,
압박감이 들어.
our
한번
constituents.
빼야 될 것
Now,
같다는.
I wanted to sort of focus on the Basel III.
그냥 가만히 있으면
Chairman
되는데.
Powell, and specifically the way that they have, there have been various proposals to sort of draw them down to focus on the regional banks. And
그렇지.
to just go back to sort of one of the most significant crises, obviously, in our banking
가자.
sector,
조금만 더 올라가면
of course, the
된다.
collapse of SVB and First Republic. You and I have spoken in private and I believe in public, but one of the concerns that I have is when we talk about increasing capital requirements on the banks, if the banks were under higher capital requirements,
그러니까요.
in the
이
run-up to
시스템
the
자체를
crisis,
만든
maybe
사람이
an
정말
argument
천재인
that
것
SVB,
같아.
for example, would have bought more long-term treasuries, which would, of
생각해
course,
보면은
reduce the
내가
balance sheet to even
투자를
more,
하는 사람이 레버리지를 땡길 수
treasury,
있고
bond
거래소에서는
risk.
그
And that, of course, would
나머지
maybe
돈을
hasten the
빌려주는
collapse of
거고.
SVB.
근데
And
그러면
I
빌려준
guess I wanted
돈을
to
손실을
start
볼 수
here with,
있잖아.
when we talk
그러니까
about,
이 사람의 원래 보증금만
some of the
잃으면
Basel
강제로 청산을 시켜버리자. 그러면 이 사람은 원래 100만 원만 가지고 매매해서 100만 원어치 100만 원에 해당되는 매매 수수료만 냈을 사람이 레버리지까지 땡겨서 수수료를 막 10배, 20배, 50배를 내게 되니까 거래소는 아무런 리스크 없이 더 큰 돈을 벌 수가 있게 됐잖아요. 거래소나 증권사.
The proposal that's out there now, I think, does extend to Category 4 as well as 3, 2, and 1.
So what's the minimum assets under management?
얘네는
that you
리스크가
guys have
없어.
proposed the
100
current
billion.
Basel regulations?
100 billion.
100 billion. And sort of that sort of gets to my concern here, because I know there's some discussion about whether you apply them at $700 billion of AUM or $100 billion of AUM.
지금까지 망한 거래소들 보면 대부분 해킹당하거나 아니면은 고객들 돈 가지고 장난질하다가 그래서 망하거나 FTX처럼 이렇게 바보 같은 짓만 안 하면 거래소가 망할 이유가 없다. 솔직히 정말 사람들한테 잊혀지거나 그런 게 아니고선 그냥 뭐 서버만 제대로 구축해놓고 보안만 제대로 해놓으면 되지. 네, 저는 비트겠어요. 아니요, 제일 유명한 곳은 거기 바이낸스. 바이낸스가 1등이고 비트겟이랑 바이비트가 약간 좀 중소 거래소 중에서는 제일 유명한 곳. 비트겟, 바이비트. 요즘엔 또 OKX가 좀 많이 뜬 것 같아요. 그 셋이 좀 바이낸스는 일단 넘사벽 원탑이고 또 그 뒤에 자잘한 거래소들 중에서는 비트겟 아니면 바이비트 아니면 OKX. 저는 일단 비트겟이 좀 눈에 익어가지고 쓰는 것도 있고 제가 예전에 크게 청산당했을 때 21년도쯤에 그때 제가 바이비트를 썼거든요. 그래서 좀 트라우마가 돼가지고 못 쓰겠더라고요. 그 바이비트 체결 소리가 꽤 좀 크거든요. 좀 날카로워요. 나 이제 그 소리를 못 듣겠더라고요. 그래서 예전에 바코드님 방송 보는데 바코드님 방송에서 체결되는 소리 있잖아요. 아, 나 그것도 못 듣겠더라. 띠링 띠링 막 이 소리가 나거든요. 네. 아, 진짜 심장이 내려앉는 기분이 들어요. 그 나한테 감당이 안 되는 그런 돈을 청산을 당하고 나니까 바이비트를 못 쓰겠더라고요. 그래서 그때는 뭐 바이비트 아니면 비트겟이었으니까 그래서 비트겟으로 넘어왔죠. 아, 나 바이비트는 이제 못 쓸 것 같아. 안 좋은 기억이 생각나요?
이번에 가장
바이낸스는
많이 올린 게 바젤 3네요. 바젤 3.
거래량은 1등인데
바젤 3가
솔직히
지금 하원에도
좀
상원에서도
규모가 너무
가장
크다
큰
보니까
이슈 중
거래소가
하나로
렉 걸리는
있는데
것도 좀 있고
그렇기 때문에
셧다운도
살짝
자주 되고
금리랑 다른
그리고
이슈들이
저희
조금
회사
부각이 안 되고 있는 것
컴퓨터에서는
같습니다.
바이낸스가 안 돌아가더라고요. 왜 그런지 모르겠는데
to say that in the process of amending, the Fed will remove the regional bank drawdown and limit Basel's application directly to the.
내가 나중에 뭐 정말 몇 억 가지고 굴리지 않는 이상은 굳이 바이낸스를 갈 일은 없을 것 같아. 네, 진성님도 그 기분 아시죠?
I appreciate that. And again, I just repeat, Chairman.
그 핸드폰에서도 소리가 났나요? 핸드폰 안 보고 있으면 소리 안 나지 않나?
I just encourage you guys not to apply a regulation that doesn't actually solve
자, 그
one problem. I fear
전혀 신경 안 쓰고 있었는데 갑자기 그 소리가 났을 때
with that in mind, I'll yield.
그쵸, 핸드폰. 아, 근데 핸드폰을 그때 보고 있으면 소리 날 거예요. 소리 켜놓고 내가 이걸 보고 있거나 핸드폰을 켜놓고 이 차트를 보고 있을 때 그 체결이 났으면 소리가 나요. 핸드폰도.
Look at success at the Fed on
네.
their mandate for strong employment and stable prices.
자, 멘탈
critical for
깨지지.
small businesses on Main Street, for farmers, for ranchers, for Montana families. You
아, 이거
follow
다시
all
내려가는
the
것
metrics.
같은데.
From
아,
your
오케이. 여기서
perspective,
춤해.
Where is the economy at now, and where's it going?
야, 아.
요거 좀 질문 괜찮다.
아야, 데리고 가라.
Solid, strong pace, and that's one thing. Second thing I'd say is the labor market is very strong and quite tight still. 3%, 3.7% unemployment for the last
그래요?
24 months. That's the longest period since 50 years.
그러니까 바이낸스 애들 걔네 미리 준비한 것 같아. 예전에 그거 보셨죠? 바이낸스 거래량 터진 거. 비트코인 이거 날아가가지고 18K 찍고 이랬을 때 그 바이낸스에서 거래량이 엄청나게 찍혔거든요. 물론 그때 바이낸스가 그 수수료 무료 이벤트를 해서 거래량이 터진 것도 있는데 왜 거래량이 없어졌냐? 네, 진성님. 그러니까 바이낸스가 원래 좀 렉이 심했거든요. 왜 거래량이 안 나오냐? 볼륨. 이거 보시면은 이때 거래량 엄청 터졌죠. 이러고 올라갔는데 바이낸스 애들은 불장이 올 거를 약간 예상하고 서버 확충까지 해놓은 것 같아.
I'm telling a farmer his business, but if you look at the food cost to the consumer, part of that is commodity costs, and that was partly spiked as because of Ukraine, grains and oil and that kind of thing.
저때 다른 데보다 유독 바이낸스에서 엄청나게 터졌거든요.
When it leaves the farm to get
어마어마했죠.
and processed and trucked around and put on the shelves and then the stores, and all of those costs are just part of the general economy. So as the labor market
애초에 저렇게 잘 됐어야지.
overheated status 2 years ago, you will see and you have seen, food inflation.
아, 춤에 됐네.
And so, the really high rates of inflation have come down. The prices, of course, have not.
Correct. I would just say that cattle's doing better. Grain actually has dropped in price at the farm gate, and I don't want to get into that debate with you at all because we probably agree, but it'd take too long.
내려가요.
Other stuff to talk about.
I'd be learning from you.
You've discussed in previous hearings the impacts that the pandemic shutdowns and supply chain issues have had on economy.
불장이 올 걸 알았을 것 같아요.
How does the U.S. economy look
다른 애들도
today
아니고
compared to our
창펑이나
competitor nations,
바이낸스 정도
particularly
급 되면 알았겠지.
Start with the advanced economies. We're doing the best of anybody. We've got the strongest growth and the lowest inflation of the advanced economies.
아,
China is a whole different story.
그냥 올라가라.
Significant difficulties with its economy right now. and they're in a very different place than certainly than we are.
And so, to repeat that, what I heard you say is that
근데 바이낸스가 뭐 일정 고객들한테 특혜를 제공하고 뭐 그랬다는데 정보 주고
Major economy, yes.
Yes. Okay. Look, one of the other challenges
그것 때문에 벌금 맞지 않았나?
in communities all across this country, whether
걔네도
you're
뒤가
in
구릴
New York
거예요.
City and Ohio,
네.
workforce housing in particular is a top priority, top commodity.
그러니까 바이낸스가
Plenty of folks, great
미국한테 처음 왔더니
organizations
지금
that
또
work
아,
every day, and I
체결됐다.
appreciate the work they're doing. But how do these housing supplies issues
지금 또
show up in
조용해요.
the data that the FOMC uses to make
일단
decisions?
본절로스 절반 털렸어요.
Housing prices don't go into the data. Housing starts and renovations and things like that are just business activity, and
아깝다.
that shows up. But when it comes to inflation, we convert ownership into an imputed rent, and then we look at rents. And so that's how we look at all that. So we're not directly
잘
affected
털었죠.
by changes in housing prices, but over time those
다 털 걸
will
그랬나?
drive rents up.
So is it fair to ask, are there economic
절반
trends that you
털었는데도
see for
좀
housing?
세네요.
Yes, so there's two big things going on. One is we have this underlying shortage of
저기까진 갈 것
housing, and
같은데
it's
한번.
due to things like, difficulties of zoning.
이번에는 물타기 안 하고 다시 올라가면 그때 불타기를 할게요. 불타기 하고 또 절반 본절 걸고. 아, FTT 수익금 보관하고 있다가 약간 그런 느낌 있네. 그때도 그 얘기 좀 들었던 것 같아요. 약간 애초에 FTT나 FTX 자체가 정부나 미국이랑 좀 많이 관련이 되어 있었는데 창펑이 때문에 약간 날아가서 좀 빡이 쳐 있다가 창펑이가 그걸로 번 돈 다 주겠다 해가지고 좀 풀린 게 아닌가.
Chairman Powell, good to see you. Thank you for being here. It's been a rather uneventful couple of days for you, considering.
그 샘 뱅크먼? 샘 뱅크먼 걔도 미국 정치인들이랑 연줄도 많았었고.
Your response earlier to Senator Scott when he asked about immigration, he said the Fed hasn't been assigned that. So I want to bring up something else you haven't been assigned to that you and I have talked about over the years, and that, of course, is climate. The role of climate in your job, the role of climate risk in banking. And you've often said, I think the most common statement was, we should stick to our knitting, I think is one of yours, stay in our lane, similar to what you said probably to Senator Scott. But that said, in October, the Fed,
그래서 약간 벌금의 형태로 로비를 한 거지.
issued climate guidance, as you know, for management of covered institutions. And so I'm just kind of curious, did Congress
그게
somewhere
맞는 것
along the line
같아요.
give the Fed authority over climate policy as well, or is that another one of those things that somebody?
클라이밋 폴리시입니다 지금. 근데 여기 이거는 사실 근데 기후 쪽은 왜 자꾸 언급이 되냐면은요, 제가 한번 찾아봤더니 이렇게 압박을 미리 해놔야 혹시라도 나중에 만약에 권한을 가지게 되면 좀 더 움직이지 못하게 만든다고 하네요. 그래가지고 지금 기후 변화 관련 정책 쪽에 대한 연준의 관심도 없고 뭐 연준의 담당도 아니고 아무것도 아닌데 왜 자꾸 기후변화 얘기를 하냐면, 혹시나 미래에 나중에 기후변화에 관련해서 연준이 한 자리 하려고 하면 그거 나중에 가서 막으려고 지금 끊임없이 언급하는 거라고 합니다. 그리고 지금 딱히 금리랑 코인 쪽은 언급이 별로 없었습니다. 네.
끝난 거야? 아니지.
For my thinking, that's it. That's what we're doing.
3시 전에 한 번은 나올 것 같은데 한 번은
3시까지 한다고 했으니까.
차라리 이렇게 된 거 진짜 막 말도 안 되는 소리 해가지고 진짜 뭐 위로든 아래든 한 20% 보내버렸으면 좋겠다. 옛날
나 그러면 죽는데.
Very good, thank you. I'm going to bring up one other topic. I don't know that's been brought up today, and that's central bank digital currency. I think
맞다.
from a lot of my friends out there, I think there's some.
CBDC네.
CBDC?
I'm easy to confuse, but there are a lot of people that get confused about.
아, 왜 자꾸 내 거 평당 근처에서만 노냐.
Admonition to continue researching, experimenting, looking at some sort of central bank digital currency. People.
아, 절반 턴 거 조금 아까운데 좀만 더
back home
들어갈까요?
Look at that and go, oh my gosh, they're going to control this now. And could you maybe just differentiate?
애초에 여기서 익절이 나갔어야
what people
됐는데.
think of in terms of a Bitcoin or they're held digital currency.
그치, 다시 가야지.
central bank digital currency, who, in my view,
춤에
should emulate cash, right? It
아까
still
좀
should
턴
be
거
about
조금만
development
들어갈게요.
about some different kind of currency. Could you just sort of help people back home better understand why they shouldn't be?
예,
pricing
수수료는 아까워하면 안
First
돼.
of all, I want to say that we're nowhere near recommending
고점에서
or
다시
let alone
털면 28K니까
adopting a central bank
아니
digital currency
68K.
in any form. But the idea is that as technology has evolved, money has become digital.
아,
So,
16달러밖에 안 되네.
but the government doesn't issue
평단이 좀 안 좋아져가지고.
digital. If you look at your bank account, people don't hold those physical dollars; they're digital. So the thought was that the government could create a digital form of money that people could then transfer among themselves. Now,
그러게요. 약간
of course,
그런
that
얘기도
raises
나올
the
수 있지
concern
않을까요?
that if
약간
that were a government
은행도 같이 하고
account, the
싶다
government would see all your
그랬었는데
transactions, and that's just something we would not
미국에서 좀
stand
그런
for
물꼬가
or
안 트이나?
propose here in the United States. That is how
근데 완전히 막 창펑이에 뭔가를 봐주는 그런 식으로 합의가 된 것 같지는
if we
않아요.
were to ever to do
그런
something,
거였으면은
we're
바이낸스
very well
US가 그렇게
think
망하게
about it.
두지도 않았을
We
것
would do this
같은데
through the banking system.
완전히
The last
망해버렸죠,
thing
그냥.
we would want, we the Federal Reserve would want, would be to have individual accounts for all Americans, or any Americans for that matter. Only banks have accounts at the Fed. And that's the way we're going to keep it. So
한 번만
it's
가라.
just really, it's a question of following technology as it evolves and in a way that serves the public better. People don't need to worry about
결국엔 미국도 팔이 안쪽으로
is
굽겠지.
remotely close to happening anytime soon.
코인베이스나 그런 미국계 거래소들 그런 애들이나 좀 도와주겠죠.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, great to see you again.
죽이려다가 살려준 정도?
I want to talk a little bit about the commercial real estate and what's happening there. The Financial Stability Oversight Council's 2023 annual report
왜 안
identified
가?
commercial real estate as a financial
아,
risk.
이러면 안 되는데.
And the Fed's monetary report also noted commercial real estate prices continue to decline.
청문회
especially
하는데도 뭐 변동성이
office,
없네.
retail, and multifamily sectors. I'm especially concerned that because of the low levels of transactions in the office sector, prices have not yet fully reflected the true decline in the value. So can you expand on the emerging risks the Federal Reserve has identified in the commercial real estate market, one? And then I'm curious, can you discuss the compound risks identified in commercial real estate lending, particularly at banks with large CRE concentrations and high fractions of uninsured deposits?
Sure. Let me see. I think there are just very, very few transactions in commercial real estate right now, particularly in the troubled areas. So it's not a question of prices still falling. It's a question that you don't have that kind of price discovery. You just have to assume that the prices are very low and have come down a lot. So on commercial real estate, we have a secular change in people working from home. This is one big part of it. That means that in many cities, the downtown office district is very underpopulated. There are empty buildings in many major and minor cities. It also means that all the retail that was there to service the thousands and thousands of people who work in those buildings, they're under pressure too. And banks will have made loans to many of those buildings. Not all of them, but many. So this we've known for some years. And so what do? We have identified the banks that have high commercial real estate concentrations, particularly office and retail, and other ones that have been affected a lot. We identify them, and we are in dialogue with them around, you know.
아, 근데 이렇게 되면 또 내 거 스탑로스만 털고 다시 가는 거네.
Do you have enough liquidity? Do you have a plan?
이제 와서
You're gonna take
추매하기에는
losses
좀
here.
그렇고.
Are you being truthful with
조금만 더
yourself
들어가자.
and with your owners? And so we've been working with them, and so for some time we've been doing that. And you know, this is a problem that we'll be working on for years more, I'm sure. There will be bank failures, but this is not the big banks. If you look at the very big banks, it's not a first-order issue for any of the very large banks. It's more, you know, smaller and medium-sized banks that have these issues. We're working with them. We're getting through it. I think it's manageable is the word I would use, but it's you know, it's a very active thing for us and the other regulators, and it will be for some time.
Thank you. Do you have concerns? Let me just ask you this. As you're talking with these small and medium-sized banks, because we know there's always could be a contagion, which we've seen in the past, do you have concerns that if they fail, that somehow this is going to impact the financial sector? And are you prepared and trying to address that and prevent that from happening?
We're trying to stay ahead of that. So we also reached out to banks that had high concentrations of uninsured deposits, and particularly uninsured deposits, and a lot of commercial real estate in the office sector. So we're well aware of that issue, and we're just trying to stay ahead of it on a bank-by-bank basis and overall.
Okay,
And so far, we've been able to do that.
thank you. Let me jump to another issue that has been on my radar. The Federal Housing Finance Agency's report on the federal home loan banks concluded that the distinction between the FHL bank's role and that of the Federal Reserve discount window as lender of last resort has not been clear, especially during times of market stress. During the 2023 banking turmoil, we saw banks rely on advances from the federal home loan banks and didn't even have relationships with the Federal Reserve to use its discount window. I know you've talked a little bit about this with Senator Warner, but how is the Federal Reserve working with the federal home loan banks to ensure that banks establish protocols to borrow from the Fed's discount window prior to times of stress?
We work with the federal home loan banks because in many cases, banks were moving their loan from the federal home loan bank to the Fed. So we need to have smooth transfer. We need to be in good touch with them. Even more important than that, though, is that banks, any bank in the United States, needs to be in touch with the discount window, know how to be able to access it, be able to access
나스닥은 다 말아 올렸는데
have control of that collateral.
달러
in
계속
many
떨어지고
cases,
있고
it just was incredibly inefficient and took a long time.
사실 롱을 봐도 될 것
actually
같아.
go through that function. The federal home loan banks are actually ahead of us in technology. We know that we need to really invest in technology to modernize the discount window, and also we need to do more to make to get our banks, all of them, in touch with the discount window in a way that they can use it quickly should they need to do so.
Thank you.
Cortez Masto, Senator Haggerty of Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. Welcome, Chairman Powell.
만약에 트럼프가 다시 대통령 되면은 우리 트럼프 연설 매일마다 봐야 돼요. 진짜로. 갑자기 뜬금없이 코인 쓰레기 뭐 이럴 수도 있고 뭐 특정 코인 얘기하면서 이거 좋음 막 이렇게 얘기할 수도 있어요.
가자.
Markets seem to expect the Fed to immediately cut even before we've breached the 2% inflation threshold. So my question is this: if the inflation rate reaches 2%, would that be considered a return to the target rate on a sustainable basis? Or is it still the case that inflation would need to more or less overcorrect to well below 2% before the Fed makes the rate cut adjustments?
It would take us a while to really get comfortable that inflation had settled in sustainably at 2%. But that's not our test for changing interest rates. Interest rates right now are well into restrictive territory. They're well above neutral. And we've said we would not wait for inflation to get down to 2% because if you wait that, monetary policy works with long and variable lags. So we've said, for some years that we would start restoring the federal funds rate to a more normal, almost neutral level. We're far from neutral now.
금리 낮추는 것은 인플레이션 2%대로 내려갈 때까지 기다리지 않는다고 합니다.
기다리지 않는다? 안 기다리고 내리겠다는 거야? 호재인데?
I know we sort of allowed the economy to overshoot when inflation was high. And we sort of made up for prior years.
야, 저 정도 발언했으면 올라가야 되는데. 올라가죠, 조금은. 너무 약해요, 아직은.
Then we got suddenly a few months later we got almost an explosion of very high inflation. That's not what we were looking. We said, moderately above or modestly above 2%. This was not modestly above 2%.
아, 여러분 1월 데이터 때문에 금리 인하가 안 일어났네. 만약에 1월에 데이터가 낮게 나왔으면 3월 금리 인하 있었네.
3월에 원래 금리 인하를 하려고 했다.
That was not the case, and we acted. And you don't see that same abrupt dynamic coming the other way. You're more comfortable.
No, I think we're in the right place, which is we're waiting to become.
대체 금리 인하하면은 비트코인이 얼마나 올라갈까?
When we do get that confidence, and we're not far from it, it'll be appropriate to begin to dial back the level of restriction so that we don't, drive the economy into recession rather than normalizing policy as the economy gets back to normal.
Yeah. Can we go to the balance sheet and talk about that? We've seen a dramatic expansion of the Fed's balance sheet over the past couple of decades. In 2005, it was at $800 billion. It's at $7.5 trillion today. It's doubled since the pandemic was underway. And through quantitative tapering, the Fed is attempting to reduce its footprint. And the concern I have is, on the other hand, government spending tends to just continue to be profligate. We're running now a $1 trillion deficit every 100 days. And we're flooding the market with Treasury debt, and we're putting upward pressure on interest rates as a result. And what I think that is lost on many of us here is that the spending levels will only make your job harder when it comes to lowering interest rates, not to mention there's a tacit expectation that the Fed will step in once the markets can no longer absorb our new issuance. I think this is a very serious problem. I think it deserves more attention. And I think we're now at a point where your objectives may be very much at odds with the behavior of our fiscal policy. Am I missing something here, Mr. Chairman, or does increased net issuance by the Treasury lead to higher rates?
I mean, in principle, more supply should lead to modestly higher rates, but that's not going to affect what we do. That's not a problem for us. Our balance sheet normalization is running very much as expected. We've decreased the size of our holdings by almost $1.5 trillion.
I hear you. I think it's troubling that we continue to put fiscal pressure by continuing to put, again, we're running a deficit of $1 trillion every 100 days, and the issuance is required to deal with that. We're putting a lot more pressure, I think, on the Fed, and again, making your job harder. I think we need to take that into consideration. Another component of this topic, your colleague Governor Waller said he'd like the Fed to shift its holdings toward a larger share of short-term treasuries. Back prior to the financial crisis, about a third of the Fed's holdings were in bills. Now they're around 3% of your total securities holdings. Do you share the goal with Governor Waller? And if so, how long will it take us to get there?
Take a while. That's an issue. We're in our FOMC meeting in a couple of weeks. We're going to have our first really deep dive on what to do with the balance sheet. That's one of the issues. I don't think we'll deal with that at this meeting, but over time, you'd love not to own a lot of MBS, and I can see a case for shortening the maturity, but it's not something that would happen quickly, and we're not actively looking at that. That's sort of a longer term aspiration that I think he was saying.
Just one final point, Mr. Chair, and you and I have talked about this before. We're in an election year. You're getting a lot of pressure. I hear it from lawmakers to adjust rates. I'm not telling you to raise rates or lower rates, but I'm just here to emphasize the fact that the credibility of the Fed depends on your remaining data-driven. The credibility of our currency as the reserve currency of the world depends on that, and I encourage you to continue to maintain that posture. Thank you.
Will do.
Thanks, Senator Haggard. Senator Warren of Massachusetts is ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it's
그러니까
been a year.
자신감을 가질 때까지 기다리고 있는데 그렇게 멀지는 않다라고 얘기했습니다.
야, 이렇게 좋은 말 해주는데 안 올라가? 원래 진작에 금리 내리려고 했다. 좀만 자신감 생기면은 금리 인하하겠다. 이렇게까지 얘기를 해주고 있는데 안 올라가네요.
Now, when these banks blew up, you went into spin mode, promising that the Fed would do better. After years of hemming and hawing, you finally agreed to put in place Basel III rules that would strengthen capital standards for the biggest banks. And I mean the biggest banks. These are the Fed's proposed rule would apply to only 37 of the nation's 4,500 banks, only the banks that have $100 billion or more in capital. Now, Chair Powell, when you testified before this committee last June, I asked you about taking responsibility for bank failures. And you said, quote, "The main responsibility I take is to learn the right lessons from this and to undertake to address them so we don't have a situation like this where we had unexpectedly a large bank fail and spread contagion into the banking system," end quote. And as part of learning those lessons, you also said, quote, that you agree with and support, end quote, Vice Chair for Supervision Barr's recommendations for strengthening the Fed's rules and supervisory practices for the big banks, and that you're, quote, confident that
절반
it leads
본절을
to a
걸기에는
stronger,
너무
more
가깝고
resilient banking system, end quote. So I just want to be clear.
좀만 더
You haven't
지켜보자.
backed down from any of your comments from a year ago, have you, Chair Powell? Right lessons, don't let this happen again, supporting Vice Chair Barr's recommendations, which include stronger capital standards.
No.
You still stand by all that?
Yeah.
Good, good. I'm glad to hear that. Now, I understand that those 37 big banks don't like higher capital rules because they are like insurance. You know, they would make the banks safer, but they cost a little money and would nip into the bank's profits. So these 37 banks are swinging their very considerable weight around to try to weaken the capital rules. They've spent tens of millions of dollars running ads during Sunday night football and millions more for an army of lobbyists to try to twist arms here in Congress. Impressive spending, but who exactly are they trying to impress? A man on the inside? You know, despite all you said last year when the banks failed about supporting Vice Chair Barr's recommendations to strengthen rules for big banks, public reporting now says
지금 하고 있는 얘기 뭐냐면은요, 너네 작년에 은행들 무너질 때 그때 급하게 막 다 잘할 거고 앞으로 잘할 거고 이것저것 할 거고 했는데 왜 아무것도 안 했냐 이겁니다. 그리고 파월 연준 의장은 발언 회피 중이고요.
you withdraw the rule. As one analyst put it, quote, I don't think they will pass a final rule without Powell's support, suggesting that the rules will have to be weakened, quote, to appease Powell. So, Chair Powell, I'm having trouble reconciling the statements you made last year, which you say you hold on to, statements you made when the headlines were all about 3 giant bank failures, and now your reported efforts to quietly weaken the rules that would strengthen capital standards for giant banks and prevent more bank failures. So let me just give you a chance to clarify the record here. Are you committed to finalizing the strongest version of the Basel III capital rules this year?
Let me first say that we have taken and are taking many more steps to deal with the problems that revealed themselves with Silicon Valley Bank, and that's around supervision. We'll have a strong liquidity.
I appreciate that, but I'm just asking about the Basel III rules, the ones that you have been
Yeah,
required for years now to put in place
Basel-
and have dragged your feet on.
The Basel III rules are not directly related. They're not the thing that is directly related to Silicon Valley Bank. As you point out, they're a longer run thing, and I would just say that we put them out for comment. We got the comments. Anybody's free to go read the comments. My view is that it will be appropriate to make material and broad changes to that before we finalize it. And in terms of, I didn't say that
Material and broad changes to strengthen the rules?
material and broad changes, and we're talking about what that'll mean in the end. I did not say that we would withdraw the rule. I said, there's a concept of reproposal, and I said we hadn't made a decision on that, but that if that turns out to be appropriate in the view of the Board of Governors, then that's something we would look at doing.
So everything you said a year ago about supporting the vice chair who is responsible for writing these rules?
You and I had a long colloquy.
Yes, we did.
If you read it again, it's on your website.
And I have.
You will see that I'm doing exactly what I said I would do in
No,
that
you
colloquy.
said you would support Vice Chair Barr.
뭐 파월 연준 의장 그 뭐 포커페이스 깨진 거 처음 봐요.
That was
you're
about
talking
Silicon
about
Valley Bank.
reproposing.
The Vice Chair for Supervision has every right to bring proposals to the board. That has happened, but as I made clear in our colloquy, you're not the comptroller of the currency. This is when I do monetary policy, I have one vote. There are 11 other voters, and that's the way it works. It's not different for the Vice Chair for Supervision.
You are the leader of the Fed, and when the heat was on last year, you talked a lot about getting tougher on the banks, but now the giant banks are unhappy about that, and you've gone weak-kneed on this. The American people need a leader at the Fed who has the courage to stand up to these banks and protect them.
간단히 얘기하면 뭐냐면 제가 딱 한마디로 줄여드릴게요. 지금 무슨 얘기했냐면 너 작년에 은행들 무너질 때 확실히 은행들 그냥 두들겨 패고 막 잡아가지고 관리한다 그랬지. 근데 왜 안 했어? 큰 은행들이 조금 불편해하니까는 다시 옛날로 돌아갔잖아. 너 똑바로 안 해? 이러니까는 우리 지금 이것저것 하고 있고 저것 하고 있고 이거 하고 있고 하니까 그런 거 다 지금 그냥 눈 가리고 아웅이잖아 막 이러면서 막 화를 내세요 아줌마가. 그랬더니 진짜 오랜만에 파월 연준 의장 포커페이스가 깨지면서
털린다.
분노를 표출했습니다.
around here between now and
아, 나 씨.
I'm also encouraged, contrary perhaps to my colleague
할 말도
from
안 나네.
Massachusetts, I'm encoured by your
아까
comments
체결이
yesterday.
됐었어야
There
됐는데
will be
입절이.
broad changes to the Basel III
일단 절반
proposal,
털렸어요.
which, as it's currently
본절로스.
proposed, would have significant detrimental impacts to credit cost and availability to small businesses. And lastly, I commend your answer yesterday that the Fed is not a climate agency. And considering the impact of climate change is not a factor in achieving your given mandate, congressional mandate, of maximum employment and stable prices. Mr. Chairman, I recently joined many of my colleagues in writing to you about my concerns about the long-term debt proposal that would mandate regional banks issue new long-term debt. I'm concerned that this will have a disproportionate impact on smaller regional banks because they're required to hold their long-term debt at both the parent holding company and insured depository bank levels. Could you explain how this aligns with the tailoring requirements set forth in the financial reform bill that we passed back in 2018, Senate Bill 2155?
So how the longer-term debt proposal aligns with that? So first of all, that's been out for comment on that one. The comments are in. We're reviewing it. So I don't want to say too much, but the theory of it in the first place was that those banks are not subject to the living will process to the extent that the GSIBs are. And this was sort of meant to be a middle step to make them more resolvable without imposing all of the burdens that we impose on the 8 GSIBs to have very elaborate resolution plans. So that was the thinking. I think on the calibration of it and all that, we have voluminous comments. We're looking at them, and we'll make an assessment and move forward as appropriate.
Well, thank you. And I know our smaller regional kind of banks would be happy to hear that thoughtful deliberation, Mr. Chairman. Understandably, you've had to raise interest rates to fight the fires of inflation brought on by reckless Democrat spending. However, a major side effect of that is the impact the rising rates are having on the cost of servicing the out of.
지금 금리 관련해서 나온 것도 사실 그렇게 크게 없고요. 뭔가 변화를 줄 만한 거는 코인도 저기 CBDC 관련해서 살짝 비트코인 묻혀서 물어봤는데 비트코인 아예 언급 안 하면서 살짝 피했고요. 누군가 직접적으로 물어봐 줘야 될 것 같아요. 비트코인 ETF 통과됐는데 이게 연준에 어떤 영향을 미치는지, 그리고 예를 들어서 뭐 이더리움 ETF도 통과를 시키느냐 되는지라고 하면 당연히 대답 안 할 테니까 뭐 이더리움이 증권 쪽에 더 가깝냐 아니면은 비증권 쪽에 가깝냐라고 물어봐서 혹시라도 만약에 증권 쪽에 좀 더 가깝다고 하면은 좀 큰 하락이 나올 거고, 비증권 쪽에 가깝다 그러면은 역으로 상승이 나오겠죠. 근데 좀 조심하는 분위기입니다. 일단은 아직까지는.
Snowballs to a point that the Fed would have to factor this into its decision making.
I think we're a long way from that, and that's a real that's a terrible place to be. That's a place where some poorer emerging countries have found themselves over the years. For the United States to get to that point, I think it's unlikely. But I do think that, and it's not our business, we should stay out of this fiscal business, but I'll say what other Fed chairs have said, which is we really need to get back to that discussion about fiscal sustainability, and both sides need to get together. The kinds of things that need to happen can only be done on a bipartisan.
지겹지도 않나 봐. 다들 금사래요. 골드 셀, 골드 바이, 골드 셀, 바이 골드. Buy, gold buy now, buy gold, buy, sell, buy, sell, gold buy now, gold buy, gold buy. 참 쓸데없다.
Establishing the facts matters.
봐봐, buy.
Financial regulators have a complete, thorough understanding of the financial environment before releasing a half-baked proposal, rule, or guidance. My question is, what do you believe is a sufficient time period that would allow your agency to accurately calibrate new sound and reasonable liquidity requirements?
That is a great question, and one we're struggling with, particularly with all the other things that are going on. We're looking at some, and this is in response to Silicon Valley Bank, we're looking at some liquidity innovations, and we're asking ourselves, which form should that take, and how long should it be out for comment, and that sort of thing. We're not ready to do that yet, but that's the question we're asking.
Follow-on question, and I'm finished, Mr. Chairman. Will you confirm that prior to the Federal Reserve issuing any new liquidity requirements, it will first conduct all necessary data collection that would allow for meaningful analysis of all potential policy options?
And please keep your answer short, Mr. Chairman.
Maybe. No,
That's very short. Thank you.
I can't, we can talk about this more, but I don't want to make a really specific commitment like that without talking to the people who are, carefully in touch with this, but that is the right thought.
Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fetterman from Pennsylvania is recognized. Well, he got here last.
No.
So, although if Senator Warnock sits down in the next 5 seconds, he's next. So, Senator Warnock, are you ready, or you want to go to War Fund? You're all so generous with each other. It's Senator Fetterman's recognized. All right. Senator Warnock is recognized from Georgia.
아, 자꾸 장난하는 것도 아니고
여기
내 거
폭탄 터지면은
평단에서
나스닥
깔짝깔짝거리니까
20%
지금
이상
본절로스만 몇 번을
떨어질
털린
거예요.
거야.
30%랑. 여기 지금 여기 있는 사람들 다 죽으면은 미국 마비돼요. 대통령 빼고 다 죽는 거야. 상원.
Interest rates are high, yet the interest being paid to deposit
내 생방입니다.
ordinary working families, working people with bank accounts. Not a lot of money in Wall Street accounts remains low. Chairman Powell, I'm concerned that when banks don't increase the interest rates on bank accounts, families are losing out on dollars that could be in their pockets. Again, they don't have the kinds of portfolios that some of the folks in this room would have. Is that good for the economy? And are you concerned that banks under your supervision are doing this?
Are not paying sufficient.
That's correct.
That's a question I haven't heard. Of course, they have the option of putting their money in money market funds, and banks compete with each other. But I'll be happy to look into that. Hadn't heard that concern.
Yeah, and I think it is worth taking a look at. Many lower income individuals and families. Again, they don't have some of the sophisticated products yet. Money markets are available, but we saw high interest rates and that not being reflected in what depositors are able to benefit from. Could those individuals and families benefit from a high interest rate on their deposits?
Sure. And it's for a long time, we had a lot of mail from people at the Fed to the Fed saying, you should raise interest rates because we're not getting anything on our checking accounts. So we solved that problem.
I don't think we're asking for that, but given the reality, the question. Yeah. So let me pivot. The Monetary Policy Report states that while demand for housing has fallen, a strong labor market has kept prices high. That matches what I've been seeing in Georgia. Too many folks can't afford a home. According to the Monetary Policy Report, mortgage rates were averaging around 7% last month. That's tough for lower income home buyers. Increases of just a percentage point or two can be the difference between owning a home or not. Are you concerned about this interplay between lower demand yet stubbornly high prices and what it means for folks trying to buy a home? And what do you think is driving these high prices?
러시아 속보입니다, 여러분. 러시아가 원유 생산 데이터 공개 금지 조치를 1년 연장했습니다. 원유 쪽이신 분들 참고하시고요.
That have to do with the pandemic and the inflation and our response with higher rates. So you have a shortage of homes available for sale because many people are living in homes with a very low rate mortgage that they can't afford to refinance, so they're not moving, which means the supply of regular existing homes that are for sale is historically low and very low transaction rate. that actually pushes up prices of other existing homes and also of new homes because there's just not enough supply. The builders are busy, but they're running into
아,
all kinds
졸린데.
of supply issues.
갑자기
still,
변동성이 죽었어요. 왜?
and workers and things
꼭
like
내가
that. So
방송 키면은
it's quite
변동성
challenging. And
죽더라.
of course, rates are high, so people who are buying, a lot of the buyers are cash buyers or are able to actually pay without a mortgage because mortgages are expensive. I will say the first problem, the longer run problem of supply, is a longer run problem. The other problems associated with low rate mortgages and high rates and all that, those will abate as the economy normalizes and as rates normalize. But we'll still be left with a housing market nationally where there's a housing shortage.
There's no question we have a supply issue, and this
이거
issue
무빙
of
3시간,
high prices,
새벽 3시까지
supply,
계속 이럴 것
of course,
같은데.
disproportionately impacts some communities more than others. According to the Monetary Policy Report, the employment rate for the black prime age labor force, that is persons
여러분들 누구 계신가요?
54 years of age, reached a historical
저 내일
peak.
출근이라서
The gap between black and white
아, 아까
prime age
익절
employment,
나든가
dropped to
청산
a
나가든가 할
50-year
것
low
같아서
at around
방송을
3%.
켰는데
We can appreciate
아,
progress,
또 내가 방송
but
키자마자
3%
변동성
gap is
뒤져버렸네.
still significant. Would you agree that it is important to continue
오늘 방송
continue
여기까지
focusing
하겠습니다.
on narrowing this gap? And if so, what tools does the Federal Reserve have to do this?
내일도 아마 저녁 방송일 거예요. 아, 오늘 너무 아깝다. 아까 익절이 나갔어야 됐는데 바로 밑에서 갑자기 1K를 빼버리네. 들어가 보겠습니다. 또 봐. 오우, 소리 왜 이렇게 커?